At the Thanksgiving dinner invitation, my son was clear. "You'll clean up afterward," so I said no. Good luck with your dinner. What should have been a celebration turned into a nightmare. Before we continue, first let me thank you for watching Granny's Voice. Please subscribe and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. We might give you a shout out in our next video. Today's special shout out goes to Wilfredo from Puerto Rico. Thank you for being part of our family. Oh, let me tell you everything. The phone call came on a Wednesday morning. My daughter-in-law's voice was sweet like honey on toast, but I knew that tone. It meant she wanted something. "Hi Margaret," she said. "We're having a big Thanksgiving this year. 20 people. Isn't that exciting?" My kitchen counter felt cold under my hands as I listened. "I need you to come early," she continued. "Maybe 9 in the morning. The turkey needs constant watching, and I'll be so busy with decorating and making sure everything looks perfect for my Instagram photos. The neighbors will be looking over the fence, you know." My small apartment suddenly felt even smaller. At 68, I'd learned to live simply after selling my big house to help my son pay for his failed business. The money had disappeared into lawyer fees and debt payments. Now I lived on what little I saved and a small pension. But my daughter-in-law's voice made my tiny kitchen feel like a closet. I walked to my bedroom where old photo albums sat on the dresser. Pictures of Thanksgivings past when I was the hostess. When my kitchen was full of laughter and the smell of my famous stuffing. When my children fought over who got to lick the mashed potato spoon. When I mattered. Now I was being asked to work like hired help while everyone else enjoyed themselves. The photos showed a woman who belonged somewhere. The woman looking back at me from the mirror seemed like a stranger. When did I become someone who accepted orders instead of giving hugs? Through my small window, I could see children playing in the apartment complex playground. Their mothers sat on benches, chatting and laughing together. Real friendships, not the careful politeness I got from my own family. My old car sat in the parking space. Its dented door a reminder of last week's accident. The repair would cost $300 I didn't have. Money I wouldn't ask for because asking meant explaining, and explaining meant admitting how little I had left. The children's laughter drifted up to my window like music from another world. The phone rang again. My son this time. "Mom, Jessica told me she called about Thanksgiving. Thanks for agreeing to help out." His voice carried that distracted quality he always had when talking to me, like I was just another item on his to-do list. "I didn't agree to anything," I said carefully. "Come on, Mom. You love cooking. It's what you do." The casual dismissal hit me like a slap. As if cooking was my only value, my only purpose. As if the woman who had raised him, taught him to ride a bike, and stayed up all night when he had fever was nothing more than kitchen help. "And Mom," he continued, "Jessica's parents will be there. They're flying in from California. Her dad just retired from his law practice, and her mom was some kind of executive. Important people. You understand. Important people." The words hung in the air like smoke. I understood perfectly. His wife's parents were guests to be impressed. I was staff to be managed. When had I stopped being important enough to matter? When had my own son started talking to me like I was the cleaning lady instead of the woman who gave birth to him? I sat in my old recliner, the one my late husband used to read his newspapers in. The fabric was worn thin on the armrests where his hands had rested every evening for 20 years. He'd been gone 3 years now, and sometimes I still made 2 cups of coffee in the morning before remembering. The loneliness was a constant companion, but this felt different. This felt like being erased while still alive. Like watching my family forget I was ever anything more than someone who showed up when they needed work done. The next call was Jessica again. She talked fast, excited about her plans. "The dining room will be like a magazine photo," she said. "I've ordered special plates and glasses from that expensive store downtown. Everything has to be perfect because I'm documenting the whole day for my social media followers. Oh, and Margaret, wear something plain, okay? Nothing that will clash with my color scheme. I'm going for autumn elegance." My clothes were already plain. After selling most of my jewelry and nice dresses to help with expenses, Plain was all I had left. But hearing it said out loud made something crack inside my chest. I walked to my small closet and looked at the few dresses hanging there. Simple things from discount stores, practical shoes, sweaters with pulled threads. In the back, wrapped in plastic, hung the blue dress I'd worn to my son's wedding. It still had the small tear from where I'd caught it on a chair while rushing to help serve cake because Jessica had been too busy posing for photos. Even at his wedding I'd been working. Even at the moment that should have celebrated his happiness, I'd been invisible labor keeping everything running smoothly. I opened the old recipe box my mother had given me 40 years ago. Inside were cards written in her careful handwriting, then my own from years of holiday meals. Thanksgiving stuffing made with love, not from a box. Cranberry sauce with real cranberries, not canned. Pumpkin pie from actual pumpkins I'd grown in my garden when I had a garden. These recipes had fed my family for decades. They held memories of children's laughter and family arguments and making up over dessert. Now they were just old cards in a box, as forgotten as the woman who'd created those memories. The doorbell rang, and I found my neighbor Mrs. Chen standing there with a plate covered in foil. "For you," she said with a warm smile. "I made too much soup again." This old lady never learns to cook for one person. She laughed, but her eyes were kind. Mrs. Chen was my age, a widow too, but she had something I'd lost. She had people who visited because they wanted to, not because they needed something. Her daughter called every day just to chat. Her grandchildren drew pictures that she hung on her refrigerator with pride, not obligation. We sat at my small kitchen table, sharing her delicious soup and talking about everything except family. Mrs. Chen told me about the book club she'd joined, about learning to paint watercolors, about the volunteer work she did at the animal shelter. She had built a life that belonged to her, not just to her children's needs. "You seem sad today," she said gently. "Family troubles." I found myself telling her about Thanksgiving, about feeling like hired help in my own son's house. Her face grew serious as she listened, nodding with understanding. "You know what my grandmother used to say," Mrs. Chen said, stirring her soup thoughtfully. After Mrs. Chen left, I sat alone with her soup bowl, feeling warmer than I had in months. Not just from the soup but from being seen. From having someone listen to me like what I said mattered. From being treated like a friend instead of a burden. I looked at my phone, expecting another call about Thanksgiving preparations, about what else they needed me to do. But the phone was quiet. I was quiet. And in that quiet, I started to hear my own voice again. The voice that had been whispered to silence over years of saying yes when I meant no. Thursday morning arrived gray and cold. I woke up at 6, the habit of early rising stronger than sleep. But instead of rushing to get ready for a day of cooking and serving others, I made myself a proper breakfast. Real eggs, not the instant kind I'd been buying to save money. Toast with the good jam I usually saved for special occasions. Coffee in my favorite mug, the one my husband had given me for our anniversary. I ate slowly, tasting every bite, remembering what it felt like to care for myself instead of everyone else. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. "Running late getting ready. Can you start the turkey? Key under the flower pot." This was it. The assumption that I would show up and work regardless of how they'd treated me. The expectation that I was so grateful for inclusion that I'd accept any role they assigned. I stared at the text message for a long time, then did something I'd never done before. I deleted it without answering. My phone felt different in my hands, lighter somehow. Like I'd just put down a heavy bag I'd been carrying for miles. I dressed in my nicest outfit, the blue dress from the closet. Not because someone else had chosen my colors, but because I wanted to feel beautiful. I did my hair the way I liked it, not pulled back severely to keep it out of the way while working. I put on lipstick, something I hadn't done in months. The woman in the mirror looked familiar, like someone I used to know. Someone who mattered. Someone who had opinions and feelings and the right to be treated with kindness. Someone I wanted to remember how to be. Instead of driving to my son's house, I drove to the park where my husband and I used to walk every Sunday morning. The trees were bare now, but beautiful in their stark honesty. No pretending to be something they weren't, No performing for anyone's approval. Just trees being trees, strong and rooted and real. I sat on our old bench and watched the ducks on the pond, remembering mornings when we brought bread crusts and talked about our dreams. When had I stopped having dreams? When had survival replaced living? My phone rang. My son's number. I let it ring until it stopped. Then it rang again. And again. Each ring felt like a demand, like an emergency that existed only because I wasn't where they expected me to be. But there was no real emergency, no crisis that required my immediate attention. Just the inconvenience of people who'd forgotten how to function without my invisible labor. The silence between rings felt like freedom, like possibility, like the sound of my own life waiting to be lived. A jogger passed by, earbuds in, completely focused on her own goals. A couple walked their dog, laughing at something private between them. An old man fed the ducks despite the sign saying not to. His face peaceful with small rebellion. All around me people were living their own lives, making their own choices, setting their own boundaries. When had I forgotten that I could do the same? When had I decided that other people's comfort was more important than my own dignity? The jogger stopped near my bench to stretch, breathing hard but smiling. She looked my age, maybe older, but there was something alive in her eyes that I envied. Beautiful morning for a run, she said, still catching her breath. Best part of my day. I used to run, I said, surprising myself. Long time ago. It's never too late to start again, she said. I started running at 70 after my husband died. Figured I had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. She stretched her calf against the bench, completely comfortable in her own skin. My kids thought I was crazy at first. Now they're proud of me. After she jogged away, I sat thinking about her words. Nothing left to lose and everything to gain. What did I have to lose? Family dinners where I worked like staff. Phone calls that were really disguised requests for labor. The careful pretense that I was valued when I was really just useful. Maybe losing those things wouldn't be a loss at all. Maybe it would be the first step toward finding something real. Something that belonged to me instead of just serving others. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. Where are you? We need you here now. The turkey isn't started and people are coming in 3 hours. You're ruining everything. The panic in her message was almost funny. Here was a grown woman who'd organized corporate events and managed a household, completely helpless because her usual helper wasn't available. How had I allowed myself to become so essential to their functioning that my absence created chaos? How had I forgotten that capable people can figure things out when they need to? I typed back a simple response. I have other plans today. Hope your dinner goes well. Then I turned off my phone completely. The silence was immediate and profound. No more buzzing, no more demands, no more emergency requests that weren't really emergencies. Just me and the morning and the ducks and the possibility of a day that belonged entirely to me. I couldn't remember the last time I'd had a whole day with no obligations to anyone else. The freedom felt almost scary, like standing at the edge of a cliff with wings I'd forgotten I had. I drove downtown to the art museum, something I'd always meant to do but never had time for. The parking was free on holidays, and the building stood elegant and welcoming in the autumn light. Inside, paintings and sculptures waited in quiet rooms, beautiful things created by people who'd had something to say and found ways to say it. I walked slowly through galleries, reading every placard, taking my time. When was the last time I'd done anything slowly? When had I stopped believing I deserved beauty and quiet and the luxury of my own curiosity? In the contemporary art wing, I found a painting that stopped me cold. It was a portrait of an older woman sitting alone at a kitchen table, but she wasn't sad or abandoned. She looked peaceful, complete, like someone who'd finally found her own company interesting. The placard said it was called Self-Portrait at 70, by an artist named Ruth Morrison. Ruth had painted herself not as diminished by age, but as refined by it. As someone who'd learned what mattered and what didn't. As someone who belonged to herself. The museum cafe was nearly empty, just a few other people who'd chosen art over obligation on Thanksgiving Day. I ordered coffee and a piece of pie, Expensive museum pie that I would have called wasteful 6 months ago. Today, my phone, still turned off, sat silent in my purse. I imagined the messages piling up, the escalating panic as my family realized I wasn't coming to save their day. Part of me felt guilty, the part that had been trained for decades to put everyone else's needs first. But a stronger part felt something I'd almost forgotten. Pride. Pride in choosing dignity over duty. Pride in remembering that I was a person, not just a function. Pride in finally saying no to people who'd forgotten how to hear yes as a gift instead of an obligation. When I finally turned my phone back on, there were 17 missed calls and 12 text messages. The progression from confusion to anger to guilt, tripping, was almost funny. Where are you? Turned into how could you do this to us? And finally, this is so unlike you, we're worried something's wrong. But nothing was wrong. Everything was finally right. I was finally remembering what it felt like to make choices instead of just accepting assignments. To matter to myself even when I didn't matter to them. I drove home as the sun was setting, feeling lighter than I had in years. Mrs. Chen was in her front yard, watering her small garden despite the autumn chill. "How was your day?" she asked, and I realized she was the first person in months who'd asked that question like she actually wanted to know the answer. "I went to the art museum," I said. "I saw the most amazing paintings and had the best piece of pie. Felt like myself again." She smiled the way people smile when they see someone they care about being happy. "That sounds perfect," she said. "Much better than peeling potatoes for ungrateful people." Inside my apartment, everything looked the same but felt different. The furniture was still small and practical. The photos still showed happier times, but the air felt cleaner somehow. Like I'd finally opened windows that had been stuck shut for years. I made myself a simple dinner, nothing fancy, nothing that would photograph well for social media. Just food that tasted good and nourished me. Food made with care for someone who deserved care. For the first time in months, I ate without thinking about what needed to be done next, without rushing to clean up, without performing gratitude for the privilege of feeding myself. The evening news was full of Thanksgiving stories. Families gathered around tables, children laughing, grandparents carving turkeys. The America of greeting cards and commercials, where everyone belonged and everyone mattered and everyone was grateful for abundance they'd never questioned. But there were other stories too, quieter ones about people who'd found different ways to celebrate. Volunteers serving meals at shelters, neighbors sharing dinner with elderly people who lived alone, friends creating chosen families when biological ones had failed them. Stories about people who'd learned that belonging was something you created, not something you waited to be given. My phone rang one more time. My son again, but his voice was different now. "Mom," he said. "Sorry. I've been thinking about today, about how we've been treating you. Jessica's parents couldn't understand why you weren't there. They kept asking who was going to help serve dinner and clean up, like that was your job instead of all of ours. It made me realize how we've been seeing you. Not as mom but as unpaid help." The words hung between us like a bridge he was trying to build from his shame to my forgiveness. I sat in my chair, listening to him stumble through an apology he should have made years ago. But I didn't feel angry anymore, just tired. Tired of being taken for granted. Tired of accepting crumbs and calling them love. Tired of shrinking myself to fit into spaces that were too small for who I really was. "I'm glad you're starting to understand," I said finally. "But understanding isn't enough anymore. I need to see changes, not just hear promises. I need to be invited as a guest, not assigned as help. I need to matter as a person, not just as someone who makes your life easier. Can you do that?" He asked, and I heard something in his voice I hadn't heard in years. He was asking, not demanding. He was requesting, not assigning. He was treating me like someone whose answer mattered, whose choices deserved respect. "Maybe," I said. "We'll see. Change takes time and trust has to be rebuilt. You can't erase years of taking someone for granted with one phone call. But it's a start. It's the first real conversation we've had in longer than I want to admit. The first time you've talked to me like I'm your mother instead of your employee." After he hung up, I sat in the gathering darkness of my small living room, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. "Oh, Not the desperate hope of someone waiting to be rescued, but the quiet hope of someone who'd finally rescued herself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose myself instead of accepting whatever others decided I deserved. New chances to remember that I was complete on my own, that my worth wasn't determined by my usefulness to others. New possibilities for a life that belonged to me. I made a list not of things I needed to do for other people but of things I wanted to do for myself. Learn watercolor painting like Mrs. Chen. Visit the art museum every month. Start running again even if it was just slow walking at first. Call that book club I'd seen advertised at the library. Say no when I meant no and yes when I really meant yes. Stop apologizing for taking up space in my own life. Stop performing gratitude for treatment that should be given freely. Stop accepting assignments when what I needed was invitations. The list grew longer as I wrote, filled with dreams I'd set aside and interests I'd abandoned. Small rebellions and large adventures, ways to fill days with meaning instead of obligation. For the first time in years I was excited about tomorrow. Not because someone else needed me but because I was finally ready to need myself. To care for myself the way I'd cared for everyone else. To give myself the attention and respect I'd been craving from others. To remember that the most important relationship I'd ever have was the one with the person in the mirror. Friday morning came quiet and mine. No early phone calls with emergencies that weren't emergencies. No rushed breakfast while planning someone else's day. Just coffee in my favorite mug and sunlight through my small kitchen window, and the first day of the rest of my life stretching ahead like an unwritten book. I dressed carefully again, not for anyone else's approval, but because I was starting to remember that I deserved care, even from myself. Especially from myself. The woman in the mirror looked back at me with recognition now, like someone greeting an old friend who'd been away too long. Mrs. Chen knocked on my door with fresh tea and curious eyes. "You look different today," she said, studying my face. "Younger somehow. Happier." "I made a choice yesterday," I told her as we sat at my kitchen table. "I chose myself instead of choosing to be useful." It sounds simple, but it was the hardest thing I've done in years. She nodded knowingly. "My grandmother used to say that the bravest thing a woman can do is disappoint people who take her for granted. Sounds like you found your courage." We spent the morning talking about books and dreams and the difference between being alone and being lonely. Mrs. Chen had been widowed longer than me, but she'd learned something I was just discovering. That solitude could be a gift instead of a punishment if you filled it with things that mattered to you. That independence wasn't something to apologize for, but something to celebrate. That the people who truly loved you would want you to be happy, not just available. She made loneliness sound like a choice instead of a sentence. And for the first time since my husband died, I believed her. My phone stayed mostly quiet, which felt like victory instead of abandonment. One text from my daughter checking if I was okay, written like she actually wanted to know the answer. One message from a neighbor I barely knew, inviting me to a potluck dinner next week. Small connections that felt real instead of obligatory. People reaching out because they chose to, not because they needed something from me. I was learning to tell the difference, and the difference changed everything. Changed how I answered. Changed how I felt. Changed how I moved through the world. Saturday brought my first real test. Jessica called, her voice carefully controlled. "Margaret, I wanted to apologize for Thursday. And to ask if you'd be willing to host Christmas this year. We know you're better at it than I am." The invitation was wrapped in flattery, but I could hear the assumption underneath. That I would be so grateful to be needed that I'd say yes without thinking. That my hunger for inclusion would override my need for respect. That the old Margaret would emerge from wherever I'd hidden her and accept whatever role they offered. "I appreciate the apology," I said carefully. "But I won't be hosting Christmas this year. I have other plans." It wasn't entirely true when I said it, but it felt like the right answer. The answer that protected the new space I was creating for myself. The answer that said I mattered too much to be taken for granted again. What other plans? Jessica asked, confusion clear in her voice. Plans that don't include working as unpaid help at my own family celebration, I said. Plans that include being treated like a welcomed guest instead of hired staff. Plans that respect my time and energy instead of assuming they belong to you. The silence stretched between us until I wondered if she'd hung up. Then she spoke again, her voice smaller now. We really messed up, didn't we? We got so used to you doing everything that we forgot you were choosing to do it. We forgot to be grateful. We forgot to treat you like family instead of like the help. Yes, I said simply. You did. But forgetting can be fixed if you really want to fix it. The question is whether you want to change how things work, or whether you just want me to go back to accepting how they've been. Whether you want a relationship, or whether you just want your problems solved. What would a relationship look like? She asked, and I heard something new in her voice. Curiosity instead of calculation. Genuine interest instead of strategic planning. It would look like asking instead of assigning. Like inviting instead of expecting. Like including me in decisions instead of just telling me what you've decided. Like remembering that I'm a person with feelings and opinions and the right to say no. Like treating my time as valuable instead of infinitely available. Like caring about my happiness instead of just my usefulness. I can try to do that, Jessica said quietly. I want to try. But I don't know if I know how anymore. We've all gotten so used to the old way. You'll figure it out, I said. Or you won't. Either way, I'm not going back to being taken for granted. I'm not going back to accepting crumbs and calling them love. I'm not going back to shrinking myself to fit into spaces that are too small for who I really am. I've remembered that I'm worth more than that, and I'm not forgetting again. The conversation ended differently than most of our conversations. It ended with possibility instead of obligation. Sunday brought visitors I hadn't expected. My son and his children appeared at my door, not with demands or assignments, but with flowers and nervous smiles. We came to apologize, my granddaughter said, her young face serious with the weight of adult mistakes. Dad told us how we've been treating you and it's not okay. We want to do better. The flowers were cheap grocery store carnations, but they were chosen instead of assigned. Given instead of expected. Offered with the kind of genuine intention I'd almost forgotten existed. We sat in my small living room, crowded but comfortable, talking like people who were trying to know each other instead of just manage each other. My grandson asked about my paintings on the wall, stories I'd never been asked to tell. My granddaughter wanted to know about my job, my friends, my life outside of their needs. They listened like my answers mattered, like I was interesting instead of just useful. It felt strange and wonderful and fragile, like something precious that needed careful tending to grow. Like a relationship that could be real instead of just functional. My son stayed after the children left, sitting awkwardly on my small couch. I don't know when it started, he said finally. When you stopped being mom and started being someone we called when we needed things done. When we stopped seeing you as a person and started seeing you as a solution to our problems. When we forgot that you had your own life and your own feelings and your own right to be happy. I'm sorry doesn't feel like enough, but I don't know what else to say. I know saying it and changing it are different things. Change is a choice you make every day, I said. It's not a one-time decision. It's choosing differently every time you pick up the phone. Every time you make plans. Every time you think about what you want from me instead of what you want from me. It's remembering that I'm your mother, not your employee. That I love you because I choose to, not because I have to. That my time and energy and feelings matter just as much as yours do. That I deserve respect and kindness, not just when you need something but always. Can you forgive us? He asked, and I saw the little boy he used to be in his eyes. The child who'd run to me when he was scared, who'd believed I could fix anything, who'd loved me without condition or calculation. That little boy was still there, underneath years of taking my love for granted. Course I can forgive you, I said. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. Doesn't mean going back to the way things were. It means starting over and doing better. It means building something new instead of trying to fix something broken. It means learning who we are to each other when we choose to be family instead of just accepting that we have to be. The weeks that followed weren't perfect, but they were different. Phone calls that asked how I was instead of what I could do. Invitations that came without assignments attached. Conversations that included my opinions instead of just my labor. Christmas came with a different kind of invitation. Not a demand disguised as a request, but a genuine question about what would make me happy. "What would you like Christmas to look like?" Jessica asked, and waited for my answer like it mattered. I thought about it carefully. I wanted to be included in planning, not just execution. I wanted to be asked what I'd like to bring instead of being assigned what was needed. I wanted to be invited as a guest who happened to be family, not as family who was expected to work. I wanted to matter for who I was, not just what I could do. We ended up having Christmas dinner at a restaurant, all of us together around a table where no one had to cook or serve or clean, where everyone could focus on each other instead of on the endless tasks that had turned celebrations into work. It wasn't traditional, but it was ours. It was chosen instead of inherited. It was built around what we wanted instead of what we thought we should want. My granddaughter sat next to me and asked about my watercolor classes. My grandson showed me a story he'd written. They saw me as interesting instead of just useful. They wanted to know me instead of just needing me. The restaurant was full of other families who'd made the same choice, who'd decided that being together mattered more than performing tradition. Older couples who'd learned that holidays were about connection, not presentation. Single parents who'd chosen ease over exhaustion. Adult children who'd learned to see their parents as people instead of just roles. We were all writing our own stories instead of following scripts someone else had written. We were all choosing what worked instead of accepting what was expected. We were all learning that love was something you created, not something you inherited. Spring brought more changes, each one small but significant. A birthday dinner where I was the guest of honor instead of the person who planned and paid and cleaned up afterward. Mother's Day that felt like a celebration instead of an obligation. Phone calls that lasted longer because we were talking instead of just exchanging information. Visits that happened because they wanted to see me, not because they needed something from me. I was learning to recognize the difference between being loved and being useful. I was learning that I deserved both, but I could survive without the second if I had the first. My own life was changing too. The watercolor classes Mrs. Chen had recommended turned into a passion I hadn't expected. The book club led to friendships with women who saw me as Margaret first, someone's mother second. The running group welcomed a beginner who was learning to move her body for joy instead of just function. I was filling my days with choices instead of obligations. With people who enjoyed my company instead of just needing my help. With activities that fed my soul instead of just consuming my time. I was learning to be selfish in the best possible way. The hardest part wasn't learning to say no. It was learning to believe that I deserved better than what I'd been accepting. Years of shrinking myself had left scars that didn't heal overnight. Sometimes I still caught myself apologizing for taking up space, for having needs, for existing as more than just someone else's solution. But each time I caught myself, I remembered that November day when I chose the art museum over the turkey basting. When I chose dignity over duty. When I remembered that I was a whole person, not just a collection of services for other people's convenience. Summer brought my grandson's graduation, and for the first time in years, I was invited as a guest. Not as the person who would handle logistics or manage details, but as someone whose presence mattered because of who I was, not what I could do. I sat in the audience wearing a dress I'd bought for myself, not because it matched someone else's color scheme, but because it made me feel beautiful. I clapped until my hands hurt and cried tears of joy that belonged entirely to me. Nobody asked me to take pictures or coordinate carpools or handle gifts. I was just grandma, celebrating a milestone that had nothing to do with my usefulness. At the graduation party, I found myself actually enjoying the conversation instead of mentally planning the cleanup. My daughter-in-law introduced me to her friends as Margaret, who's become quite the artist, not as my mother-in-law who helps out with everything. The difference in phrasing revealed a difference in seeing. I was becoming visible as a person instead of just functional as a helper. The friends asked about my paintings, my book club, my life outside of my family role. They saw me as interesting, as someone worth knowing beyond my relationship to other people. My son found me later, sitting on the back porch watching his children play in the yard. "You look happy," he said, settling into the chair next to me. "Really happy, not just mom happy where you're pleased because we're pleased." "I am happy," I said, watching my granddaughter attempt a cartwheel on the grass. Took me too long to remember that my happiness mattered too. That being a good mother didn't mean disappearing as a person. That loving you all didn't require me to stop loving myself. That service without respect isn't love. It's just enabling people to take you for granted. We sat in comfortable silence, watching the children chase fireflies as the sun set. This is what I wanted all along, I realized. Not to be needed constantly, but to be valued consistently. Not to be the solution to every problem, but to be welcome at every celebration. Not to disappear into my usefulness, but to be seen in my wholeness. To be invited because I was loved, not assigned because I was available. To matter as Margaret, not just as mom or grandma or the woman who handled things so nobody else had to think about them. Fall came again, bringing the anniversary of my Great Thanksgiving Rebellion, as Mrs. Chen had started calling it. My family planned a celebration dinner, not because they needed me to cook it, but because they wanted to mark the day I finally chose myself. We went back to the same restaurant where we'd had Christmas, the place that had become our symbol of choosing connection over tradition. This time, though, the dinner was for me. A celebration of the day I stopped accepting crumbs and started expecting the whole meal of love and respect and recognition. The server brought out a small cake with a single candle, and my granddaughter made a speech that brought tears to my eyes. She talked about learning from my example that it was okay to have boundaries, that saying no to some things meant saying yes to better things. That watching me choose my own happiness had taught her that she could choose hers too. That I hadn't just changed my own life, I'd shown her what self-respect looked like. She said I was her role model, not because I did everything for everyone but because I'd finally learned to do something for myself. After dinner, we walked through the same park where I'd met Jeremy that first Thanksgiving day. The bench where we'd shared rebellion and pie was empty, waiting for the next person who needed to remember that their life belonged to them. I'd never seen Jeremy again, but his words had stayed with me. The reminder that when people start treating you like furniture, it's because you've been standing still too long. The encouragement that it's never too late to start dancing to your own music. The gentle wisdom that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is disappoint people who've forgotten to appreciate you. My phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Chen, who was visiting her daughter in Seattle. "Thinking of you on your special day," it said. "Proud of you for teaching an old dog new tricks." The old dog being me, learning that I could say no without the world ending. Learning that I could choose myself without becoming selfish. Learning that boundaries weren't walls to keep people out, but gates that let the right people in. Learning that respect was something I could require instead of just hoping for. Learning that love without respect wasn't really love at all. Winter brought new challenges and new opportunities. My book club decided to try writing our own stories, and I found myself putting words to experiences I'd never examined closely. Writing about the years of slow diminishment, the gradual erosion of my sense of self-worth, the moment when I finally said enough. Writing about the difference between being grateful and being taken for granted. Writing about learning that there was space in the world for my voice, my needs, my dreams, my right to take up room and matter and be seen as more than just someone's helper. The story grew into something larger than I'd expected. A memoir of sorts about finding yourself after decades of losing yourself in other people's needs. About the revolution that happens when you finally remember that your life belongs to you. About the courage it takes to disappoint people who've grown comfortable with your sacrifice. About learning that being a good mother, a good woman, a good person didn't require you to disappear into your usefulness. About discovering that the people who truly loved you would want you to be happy, not just available. My family read the early chapters with expressions I couldn't quite identify. Shame, maybe. Recognition. The discomfort that comes from seeing yourself reflected in someone else's pain. My daughter-in-law cried when she read the part about the Thanksgiving invitation, about being assigned dinner roles and cleanup duty like hired help. I didn't know, she said, though we both knew that wasn't entirely true. She'd known, but she hadn't cared to examine what her knowledge meant. She'd known, but she'd been too comfortable with the arrangement to question whether it was fair. The hardest chapter to write was about forgiveness. Not the easy kind that erases history and pretends nothing happened, but the complicated kind that acknowledges hurt while choosing to move forward anyway. Forgiveness that came with conditions and boundaries. Forgiveness that said, I will love you and I will not accept being treated badly. Forgiveness that required change, not just apologies. Forgiveness that protected the new relationship we were building instead of trying to resurrect the old one that had died from neglect and taking each other for granted. Spring brought a phone call that surprised me. A small publishing company had heard about my memoir through a friend of a friend. They wanted to know if I'd be interested in sharing my story more widely. Other women, they said, were living versions of my experience. Other mothers and grandmothers who'd lost themselves in decades of service, who'd forgotten that their lives belonged to them. Other women who needed permission to choose themselves, who needed to see that it was possible to set boundaries without losing love, to demand respect without becoming selfish. The book came out the following fall, 2 years after my Great Thanksgiving Rebellion. The title was simple: Choosing Myself, a Revolution of One. The cover showed an empty chair at a set table, representing the choice to step away from roles that diminish you. The dedication read, For every woman who has forgotten that she deserves more than crumbs from her own family's table. For every mother who needs permission to matter as more than just someone else's solution. For everyone brave enough to choose dignity over duty. The response overwhelmed me. Letters from women across the country sharing their own stories of invisible labor and taken-for-granted love. Stories of adult children who'd never learned to see their mothers as whole people instead of just support staff. Stories of grandmothers assigned cleanup duty at their own family celebrations. Stories of women who'd read my book and found the courage to say no, to set boundaries, to remember that their lives had value beyond their usefulness to others. Stories of families that had learned to do better once someone brave enough to demand better. Book signings became unexpected therapy sessions where women shared their own moments of recognition. The moment they realized they'd been accepting emotional crumbs while serving emotional feasts. The moment they understood that being constantly needed wasn't the same as being deeply valued. The moment they decided that their children's comfort with taking them for granted wasn't more important than their own dignity. These women became my community, my chosen family of people who understood that love without respect was just elaborate manipulation. My own family attended my first book reading, sitting in the front row with expressions of pride mixed with residual guilt. They'd learned to be proud of my success without trying to take credit for inspiring it through their neglect. They'd learned to celebrate my independence without resenting the boundaries that maintained it. They'd learned that supporting my dreams meant more than just showing up. It meant continuing to choose respect over convenience, appreciation over assumption, invitation over assignment. It meant remembering every day that I was a person, not just their person. The question and answer session after my reading was filled with stories of transformation. Women who'd started saying no to holiday hosting duties and discovered their families were capable of figuring things out without them. Daughters who'd realized they'd been treating their mothers like personal assistants and had begun building actual relationships instead. Adult children who'd learned to ask instead of assume, to invite instead of assign, to appreciate instead of just expect. Families that had discovered love was stronger when it was chosen instead of just inherited. One woman raised her hand and asked the question I'd been waiting for. But what if they don't change? What if you set boundaries and demand respect and they decide you're too much trouble? The audience went quiet, waiting for the answer they all needed to hear. Then you know where you stand, I said. Then you stop wasting energy trying to earn love from people who only value your labor. Then you invest in relationships that see you as worth the effort. Then you remember that being alone with dignity is better than being surrounded by people who take you for granted. The truth was, some families didn't change. Some adult children preferred the convenience of mothers who accepted any treatment over mothers who expected respect. Some relationships couldn't survive the introduction of boundaries because they'd been built on inequality and exploitation rather than love and mutual care. But those losses, painful as they were, made room for healthier connections. They cleared space for people who saw worth beyond usefulness, who valued presence over performance, who understood that real love enhanced both people instead of diminishing one for the benefit of the other. My second Thanksgiving after the book was published brought a different kind of invitation. Not to my family's celebration, but to speak at a community center for women who were spending the holiday alone by choice instead of accepting invitations that came with conditions attached. Women who'd chosen dignity over duty, self-respect over family peace. Women who were learning that solitude chosen was different from loneliness imposed. Women who were discovering that being alone with people who appreciated you was better than being surrounded by people who didn't. We shared a potluck dinner where everyone had brought something they wanted to make, not something they'd been assigned. We told stories of liberation and boundary setting, of families that had learned to do better and families that had chosen not to. We celebrated the courage it took to choose ourselves when the world told us that good women sacrificed everything for everyone else's comfort. We raised glasses of cheap wine to the radical act of believing we deserved respect, appreciation, and love that didn't require us to disappear into our usefulness. Later that evening, I sat in my apartment with Mrs. Chen, who'd become not just my neighbor but my dearest friend. We looked through the photo album I'd started keeping after my rebellion, pictures of art classes and book club meetings, hiking trips and birthday parties where I was the celebrated guest instead of the unpaid help. Pictures of a life that belonged entirely to me, filled with people who saw me as interesting and valuable and worth spending time with simply because of who I was, not what I could do for them. You know what I'm proudest of? I said to Mrs. Chen as we closed the album. Not the book or the speaking or even changing my family's behavior. I'm proudest of remembering that I deserved better. That I was worth more than cleanup assignments and parking restrictions. That my happiness mattered as much as anyone else's. That being a good mother didn't require me to be a bad daughter to myself. That love without respect wasn't really love, just familiar dysfunction dressed up in holiday traditions and family obligations. Mrs. Chen smiled and patted my hand with the gentle affection of someone who'd watched me fight my way back to myself. You taught me something too, she said. You showed me that it's never too late to write a new story. That we don't have to accept the roles other people assign us just because they're comfortable with those assignments. That revolution doesn't require armies or protests. Just one person brave enough to say, I deserve better than this and mean it enough to act on it. Just one person choosing dignity over the familiar comfort of being taken for granted. 3 years later, my story had reached thousands of women through the book, through speaking engagements, through the quiet revolution that happens when people start believing they deserve respect instead of just hoping for it. My family had settled into new patterns of relating that included my boundaries as non-negotiable features rather than personal attacks. They'd learned to plan celebrations that included me instead of employing me. They discovered that appreciating someone meant more than just using them efficiently. They'd remembered how to love me as a person instead of just needing me as a function. But the most important change was internal. I'd remembered who I was beyond my usefulness to others. I'd reclaimed my right to take up space, to have needs, to expect respect, to choose how I spent my time and energy. I'd learned that boundaries weren't selfish walls but healthy gates that let the right people in while keeping exploitation out. I discovered that being alone with dignity was infinitely better than being surrounded by people who saw me as a solution to their problems rather than a person worthy of their love. My fourth Thanksgiving post-rebellion was spent with my chosen family of book club friends, Mrs. Chen, And yes, my biological family too, but on terms that honored everyone's humanity instead of just their convenience. We gathered not because anyone had to be there, but because we all chose to be there. No one was assigned roles or duties. No one was taken for granted. Everyone contributed because they wanted to participate, not because someone else had decided what their participation should look like. It was what family was supposed to be. Mutual care and appreciation rather than one-sided service and obligation. As I looked around the table at faces that saw me as valuable rather than just useful, I thought about all the women still living versions of my old story. Still accepting crumbs from their families' tables. Still shrinking themselves to fit into roles that diminished them. Still believing that being constantly needed was the same as being deeply loved. Still waiting for permission to choose themselves instead of choosing sacrifice. Still afraid that setting boundaries would cost them love, not understanding that relationships requiring you to accept disrespect weren't built on love anyway. The revolution continues, one woman at a time. One boundary at a time. One moment of choosing dignity over duty at a time. One decision to value yourself enough to demand that others value you too. Starts with a single word, no. No to clean-up assignments disguised as family participation. No to being taken for granted by people who claim to love you. No to accepting less than you deserve just because asking for better feels uncomfortable. No to disappearing into your usefulness instead of being celebrated for your wholeness. And it continues with an even more revolutionary word. Yes. Yes to relationships that enhance you instead of diminishing you. Yes to boundaries that protect your peace instead of maintaining other people's comfort. Yes to being valued for who you are instead of just what you can do. Yes to taking up space in your own life instead of shrinking to accommodate everyone else's expectations. Yes to the radical act of loving yourself enough to require that others love you well too. Now tell me, what would you have done if you were in my place? Would you have continued accepting crumbs from your own family's table? Or would you have chosen the harder path of demanding the respect you deserved? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching Granny's Voice, and don't forget to check out the video on your screen right now. I'm sure it will surprise you.